welcome to another webinar at the National Library of Scotland. My name is Kenny Redpath and I am the Events Officer at the Library. This afternoon I'm delighted to be introducing Professor Joanna Geyer-Kordesch, who's here to talk about her book, Why Gardens Matter. And we're doubly delighted that Joanna will be in conversation today with Donald Smith, who was a contributor to the book. Now, just a little background on both our speakers today. Joanna has had a distinguished academic career, bringing the disciplines of history of medicine and cultural history as embodied in her landscapes. After becoming the first woman to direct the Welcome Unit for the History of Medicine at the University from 1990 to 2001, she became Professor of European Natural History and History of Medicines at the university. Since retirement, Joanna has continued her research interests while developing a parallel, it's not that easy to say, career as a poet, artist, and creative essayist. Donald Smith is a storyteller, novelist, playwright, and founding director of the Scottish Storytelling Centre. He has written non-fiction books on Scottish politics and geography, and also written a series of historical novels. And from meeting Donald this morning, I believe a new book is due out very soon. And of course, Donald is currently director of the Scottish International Storytelling Festival. But before handing over to Joanna and Donald, can I just say that there will be time for questions at the end of the webinar. So please get thinking and just type your questions into the Q&A function, and we will do our very best to get through as many as we can. So now over to you, Joanna and Donald.
All right.
Good afternoon, everybody, and it's a tremendous pleasure for Joanna and I to be with you today to talk about Why Gardens Matter, the book, but also the theme. And I just want to start by giving a little bit of background to how the book came to be, because that is in itself quite a dramatic story. Now, Joanna and I had already connected on creative interests around narrative and storytelling when we jointly embarked on a project supported by the Wellcome Foundation called Stories and Cures. And we were looking at the role of narrative in medicine, but also the role of traditional stories in the lore of plants and cures. And this project was well in its way, and we were preparing to deliver a series of events for a Scottish International Storytelling Festival a few years back now. And very sadly and suddenly, as these things happen, on the verge of these events, Joanna experienced a massive stroke and was very, very ill for quite a number of weeks. But being Joanna, as I think you will find out as we get into this conversation, a very determined lady, she was not willing to lie down and give up. And she fought back to health, to an ability to write and to draw again, while having to live with a degree of ongoing disability. And it was in that process of recovery for Joanna and recovery of our shared project that gardens began to play an increasing part in our thinking. And it's that journey that has led to this really, I feel, quite classic little book, beautifully produced by Lewis, who also gave us the title, Why Gardens Matter. So Joanna, we're here to open up this book and the theme, but perhaps you might say just a little bit, following on from what I've been saying, about the part that gardens came to play in your long recovery from the stroke.
Well, I was really, really quite restricted through my disability. My whole right side could no longer function. And I'd been so good at writing, and I was beginning to draw, and everything exploded into nothingness. And I then decided that I would not give up, and no one should give up. I'm only one example of what can be done. And we went from stories and cures, I think, into the Botanic Gardens and to my own garden, to just kind of see and look and observe more closely than I ever had before. And this resulted in seeing not only flowers, but leaves, and how they emerge, and how they are hidden again in the winter, and how important these roots are for a regeneration. And although I've been suffering a lot of this, I can't move this hand. I can only move it. I cannot draw with it. I cannot write with it. I cannot do anything with it. And I then migrated to this left hand, and it became the treasury of all the things I could do before. But it took a long time.
So in fact, Joanna, one of the things that went into the making of the book was the journals and diaries and sketchbooks that you kept during this long period of recovery. And it began with the gardens at Astley Ainsley, where you were recuperating, and then, as you say, in your own gardens. And we have used those journals to illustrate the book. So some of the historical side of the book has plans and prints of historic important gardens, botanic gardens and landscape gardens. But then as the book develops, the illustration becomes your work. And I found it, I just have to say, quite an astonishing experience to follow all those journals where you began struggling again to draw and write, but gradually through your response to the plants in words and in sketches and paintings, this sense of a relationship with the natural world through the garden develops. So we've tried to reflect that in the book, haven't we? The role of art and creativity.
Yes, there are several aspects to this which are quite important. One is the historical aspect of it all, that you look at what happened in centuries past, and they tell you through gardens what they're very mute, and they tell you through the gardens how you can develop as a person through meditation, through everything that encounters what you do. And you do sit down and you think about the trees and how they grow, and that is so important, that you come from the monastery gardens, from the medieval parterre gardens, into those lively natural gardens, the landscape gardens, and then the landscape gardens transfer into the picturesque garden, and you see how century after century after century, the garden develops, and yet in the present, you can relate to these and they evoke emotions. My book is not related so much to an academic look at this precise kind of development in a garden, but the general emotion that the garden evokes. It is much more about how the onlooker experiences these gardens, and they may do so in different ways.
So the first half of the book has a sort of creative overview of these different kinds of experiences of gardens that, you know, through history, but many of them are still with us to be experienced. And then the second half is really about more immediate creative response now, and that different kind of experiencing that we can have in the garden environment. So one aspect of this, Joanna, that I know you'd like to say a bit about is we dipped in, of course, to a huge literature of gardens. And one of the things that you highlighted was the importance of gardens in children's literature.
Yes, because my purpose of this book is not academic, but creative. And creative is so much present in children's books. I took a number of these. I took Lucy Boston. She's very well known, The Secret Garden, Frances Hodgson Burnett. And she really, really does show you how in The Secret Garden, everything kind of colludes, and she starts with experiencing bulbs growing and roses expanding, and the wonderful red-breasted robin coming to cheer her on and discover for her the hidden gateway to the secret garden. And because she's able to do this, she is no longer confined to people doing things for her. And she tells the disabled, I have much sympathy with him, the disabled Colin, to get out of bed. And, you know, there are things like that which aid you, and they are wider and more presented in children's books than anywhere else. I never read children's book until very late in life. And then all of a sudden, their creativity expanded on my into the garden, because they do handle nature and gardens. You just have to go and read.
So it's interesting, isn't it, that probably a lot of people maybe don't consciously realize how big a part gardens play in children's literature, from Beatrix Potter to the Secret Garden, and those deeper themes about people growing and regeneration and healing through the garden experience. So that's a huge, we're here in the National Library, as it were, there's a huge interesting theme connecting us with written literature as well as traditional stories. And then, of course, there's the whole thing about visual arts, so that's in the book because your own response to the gardens has this rich visual kind of aspect. But then you also look at sculpture in the gardens. You have written a lot about Ian Hamilton Finley's garden at Dunsire. So would you like to add anything to that whole side of the visual arts, the visual design and creativity?
Well, first of all, in the visual garden, you see things more detailed, more expressively, more related to looking. And you and a certain plant develop a kind of attachment. And that is very, very important if you're going to draw. It's very important to exercise any hand, but if you're crippled like me and you lose your right hand, you do have to try and replicate that leaf in a kind of creative green. And the more creative you are, this leaf might turn blue or red or whatever you want. But the response is that you create something that is worth a great deal of input to you. And you learn why there is a red and a blue and a green and a yellow, and why blue and yellow make green, for example. and it goes on and on that way. It is very, very important that the plant gives you the observation and that you return the observation to the plant.
So it's very interesting, isn't it, that for even this applies to the smallest garden or little situtory or courtyard or whatever it might be. There's an element of design involved for all of us in shaping the visual pattern of it all and engaging with how the plants look and how we're going to be able to relate to them. And we look at some quite notable gardens in Scotland that are both perhaps historic but also creative. So we've mentioned Dunsire. You talk about monastery gardens, and we touch on Iona, the convent garden in Iona, the Drummond Castle garden. So I mean, we're very lucky in Scotland and even here in Edinburgh itself with the range of different kind of gardens we can experience, right down to our own little personal spaces. So you really celebrate that in the book.
It is really, really important not to just drive by. It's very important to stop and take something in. This, relates to the kind of Adam's desire to recreate, for example, Culzean Castle, which is medieval in its turrets and its structure, and it looks out over the Scottish Ocean. But you have to go slow and take in why he recreated something medieval for current and present Scotland in the late 18th century, for example. So you have the historical buildings in the present with gardens, and they must say something to you. I remember going to Culzean Castle when I was disabled and seeing these wonderful spewing waves right in front of the castle.
Yeah.
Right, Scottish.
So it's this relationship between the garden and then the wider natural world, and the garden's almost our pathway, our channel. This thing about going slow is a big theme, isn't it? We need to rest, we need to walk, we need to meditate, and that's one of the things the garden offers, is the opportunity just to slow down.
Yes.
Get away from these awful screens. Oh, sorry. We all should be out gardening, but no, we're here for a little conversation.
Well, I'm fortunate in that I don't dig up the soil. I just wash it. I can't.
So that's an important thing, though, isn't it, Joanna? And you speak quite strongly about that, about the importance of adapting our gardens for people of different abilities and capabilities, that everybody should be able to have that chance of the garden experience.
When I was looking at gardens at the beginning, my academic career was in medicine, history of medicine, so on. And I looked at plants, and then I went to a garden center, and they were very kind. They brought separate plants that I would like to dig into my garden, and I asked about them. And it was really a good conversation, as a conversation with you is good, that these people in plant centers helped you all the way and were kind and would tell you what the growth of this plant meant, and you could incorporate it where you wanted it.
So that garden experience is a shared one that everyone can have
Yes.
access to, from the smallest to the largest. And that maybe just reminds me about the way we kind of increasingly stumbled then on the existence of community gardens. And you'll remember we held a very good event as part of our garden theme in the Storytelling Festival at the Botanic Gardens in the Botanics Cottage, where we brought together people from the different community gardens in Edinburgh, the Redhall Walled Garden, Dr. Neil's Garden at Duddingston, the Leith Community Crops and Pots, the community croft there in Leith, the Loch End Secret Garden. And I was just looking last week actually, and there are about 25 community gardens now in Edinburgh alone. It's a growing thing. And during the COVID emergency, those spaces have become vital meeting places, play spaces for kids who were very confined or not able to go to school, places we could still grow food, places that people could safely, meet up and have outdoor activities. So it's interesting that even as we were finalizing the book, through this kind of experience, our story was developing. And I think we were able just to capture a little bit of that in the section about community gardens. So it's quite interesting, the whole land use thing. We have so much space that actually could be used as shared garden space. So there's a kind of almost political aspect to that as well. What kind of society do we want to be in terms of the land, and perhaps greening our cities even more through community gardens? Is that too political, do you think? No?
Oh, no. I think it's important for each and every one, no matter what the wider aspects are. But in going into a garden, you realize that you're surrounded by green spaces, and you should be able to think that this is what I want to investigate, because they never stay put. They are always changing from summer lushness to autumnal colors to winter bareness and roots, and then they resurrect in the springtime. And this year, for example, is very lush. My garden just now is the best place to be in, because the roses are going to suddenly appear. They've had lots and lots of buzz, and now they are springing at you and, in all their wonderful colors. And I use a lot of pots to put plants in, because in a pot, A, you get the right soil, and B, you can observe this plant knowing that it's in front of you, and then you can paint it carefully, and no matter what, improve as you go along. And it's always important that you are not static, because the plant is never static.
So the
it will criticize you.
The plants aren't static, and the seasons are not static. So that's a very interesting theme in your observations and in your drawings and in some of the poems you've written about the gardening experience as well. So is it almost that you would be suggesting that the way the garden shows the changing seasons is very much like our own human lives, that time is passing and we go through different seasons of happiness and trouble, and somehow the garden accompanies us through these changing experiences?
I think it goes with us, and we can, even if we're dejected, we go out and we can see that this or that plant is coming to fruition, and you are embarrassed by your own depression or anxiety or mental, sluggishness, I would say almost, and you brighten up and go out, and especially in sunny weather, these shaded and these very green areas, and even the grasses. Now that I look more carefully, I can see they have different shapes. These invasive grasses that surround your pots. And there are lovely things like thistles, and there are wonderful things like red campion. These are all invasive species that have delightful areas in which they crop up like that, and you didn't intend it. Also, I love the foxgloves that, they grow so high and have so many, many flowers, and then shade out what is beneath them. And you can just talk to foxgloves. They're lovely.
So there's always something unexpected to see, isn't there? If we just take time to look, to observe, because these little changes, suddenly a flower opens unexpectedly one morning, suddenly some seedling pops through, and always something unexpected. And now in that regard, one of the things I know that we've both found during the lockdown year is an increase in birds in the gardens, and that's been very, very interesting. A wider range, we've seen a wider range of birds where we're able to encourage insect life. This also helps the birds and the varieties. So it's been quite a rich time while we've all been restricted and in great difficulty and great sadness through people who've been lost to COVID. There's been a slightly consoling thing going on, perhaps, in our gardens.
Well, you see, the blackbird sings to you, and then the wren dips in and out, but you know she's there. And then you have what is usually considered a weed, the dandelion. And then you discover that the dandelion is rich food for bees. And so my own lawn has become speckled with yellow. And so I let them grow now.
So, as you know, I've been gathering traditional lore about gardens for some time now, and that is going to be a new book, Folklore of the Garden. And it's funny, you just mentioning there those two birds. So the blackbird, the song of the blackbird is deeply rooted in Celtic tradition as a sort of melody of the heavens almost, and the Celtic hermits and anchorites were devoted to the music of the blackbird. No human music could equal it. It was on a divine level. And of course, the wren, which I think I'm right in saying is the most numerous and species of any bird in Britain and Ireland. There is a huge amount of lore about the wren as king of the birds, about the sacrifice of the hunting of the wren, and folk plays and songs and what else. So it's such a rich scene when you begin to dig in. It's got so many aspects. And I'm curious, something, and maybe that is something, I don't know, that you've carried from your scholarship and learning. You have a fantastic knowledge of different plants, I have to say, just from conversations, and also a fantastic memory in remembering the names of plants. I am not good at remembering the names of plants, and you are much better than I. So do you think that's a kind of almost a kind of habit of mind that comes from the old herbals and the botanic garden catalogues that you've loved to study in the past?
Well, my memory now is going much the direction of yours. There's none of it. But
I'm ahead though. I'm ahead.
I would recommend that if you buy, for example, a David Austin rose, which are good roses, and he has a label on every single one of them, and keep that label.
So that's funny because I did, one of my big lockdown jobs was to clear an old shrubbery and replace it with a mixture of roses and 2 small apple trees. And I got the roses from David Austin Roses, no advertising here, no product placement, including a lovely one named for Gertrude Gico, the garden designer. And this is another aspect, isn't it? When you look at the historic side of the gardens, we see some exceptionally creative pioneers who really changed the way we thought about gardens. Her great thing about herbaceous borders.
Yes, I think that the Austin roses, by the way, I look at the catalogs and then I know the names, but we have just recently, for our garden, bought the Nye Bevan rose, which is a beautiful light beige rose.
Right.
And it has many, many hues and different colors. And well, it stays in the Nye Bevan category, but it will flower and remind us. It's not only a rose, it's also a reminder. And we have a number of roses that haven't been named after certain people, Gertrude Jekyll or Harlow Carr, and all of these different roses are memories as well for people that we know or would love to know. And the rose that flourishes before us.
So it's a language of flowers, isn't it?
Yes,
Really, the
yes,
association,
yes.
the naming, it's like traditional tunes.
Yes.
So on the same vein, visiting one time the Botanic Gardens in Cambridge, we found a Stanwool Rose that was actually a variety that had been originally begun created at the Botanic Gardens in Cambridge. And Stanwool's the name of the nursery school where my wife Alison's been the head teacher for many, many years. So we had to have a Stanwool rose, and we planted some at the nursery in the garden, and we've got one in our little garden here at home.
Well,
so
I think it's very, very great to remember the names and to know what the names stand for. But if you forget, we have some roses that have no names, and they're just as prolific right now, and they climb and climb, and I love looking at them. You only have June and July really for profuseness, and then you get single roses, very few of them, and you have no roses when the first frost comes.
So it's interesting. I know people are joining this event from different countries, and they might be interested that in Scotland we do experience the seasons very intensely. Our growing season is really relatively short, and we have to really go for it to maximize that. And spring often happens quite swiftly and quickly, and we have a long winter, and we have the experience of dark and light. So every culture and country has a little bit of a different balance in its sense of the seasons and the gardens. And just one other thing there before we lose it is, I think a connecting sort of thread through the whole book is that idea that gardens are places of memory. So we've talked about the plants, and we've talked about sometimes sculptures or artworks or things of memory, but just as a whole, the garden is a place to reflect and remember. And that's maybe a very strong aspect of what it offers our lives.
Well, my physio who comes and helps me remember that it would be very good just to sit in a garden, not constantly dig it and plant it and revise it and do things to it, but just sit there and see what this lovely, lovely green space does for you. And I think it does do things. It makes it more quiet, more calm, more reflective. And that, that is the whole point of this book, to realize the association between the garden and the person who sits in it.
So, and that's a sort of well-being kind of idea or
Yes.
theme, isn't it? That runs through everything. The garden can be a place of memory. It can be a place of healing. Yeah, and that's a big part. So there's another thing related to that. We mustn't go on too long here because I know people will have not just questions, but maybe thoughts and comments from their own experiences. And that is the garden as a place of conversation and friendship.
Yes, you have many, many people who can talk about garden, be they an advice or mulch or mold or whatever, and it distracts from you. It finalizes the green growth of things, and you are only a small part of this.
So in the center of the book, at the very middle, almost like a hinge between the kind of overview of the different traditions of gardens, small and large, and landscapes and intimate and all the rest of it, and the second half, which looks at art and healing and memory and creativity, we have a conversation. And it's an actual record of a conversation that you and I had, maybe over a couple of different occasions, simply sitting in gardens, talking about these different themes. And in a way, that conversation helped shape the book.
Yes, it extends forward and backward. It's right in the middle. And that's one of the things that is very important. And although it is a conversation, it should be read.
Read, or I suppose heard, and in fact we did, and it's referenced in the book. We did make a little film in the end in order to complete the Stories and Cures kind of project, because we weren't able to do some of the events that we had hoped to do. We did make a little film, which is really a conversation quite soon in your kind of time of recovery. So that's an interesting record of that time, I think.
Well, I think reflecting back, it was very, very good that we called it Stories and Cures. And the garden is, in a sense, that quiet place of cure, and you can invent your own stories.
Interesting. So there's something funny as well about that conversation being in the middle, and we had a lot of help from the Lewis team and so on in this, but trying to decide where things in this book should go, so conventionally something like that conversation, you would say, oh, well, that's an introduction. But no, because kind of the book, it's a bit like a garden. It's got all these different bits in it. And actually the idea of conversation and sharing, it ended up in the middle, because would it be fair to say that the purpose in creating this book is to share this sense of garden experience and to encourage everybody to reflect on and deepen and widen and celebrate their own experience of gardens?
Well, as an academic, you're used to theoretical things, and this is truly activating the reader more than anything else. You and I diminish, and the reader gains by reading this book.
Yeah.
by learning about how to have the emotional reflection on landscape gardens and other gardens, and then to come forward and try out the creativity of the garden that gives you creativity. And in the middle, no doubt, we are there.